tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're talking about Hey Arnold, which is very interesting because it started out as an idea and evolved into a completely different idea. It was a cartoon, a Nickelodeon cartoon, or a Nicktoon, which started in 1996. And I seem to remember, when I was looking this up, it went on airing in America until 2004.
Yeah, they took ages on Nick in America, finishing off the final season, the 5th season. In fact, CITV had already shown all the episodes they were going to show by the end of 2001. They held some back for 2 or 3 years for various reasons in the US, so that air date makes it appear longer and more enduring than it really was. 5 seasons, basically.
Which is quite enduring for a cartoon, mind you.
Yes, it was the second longest running Nicktoon ever behind Rugrats, but since things like SpongeBob SquarePants have overtaken it, it no longer features very highly in that list. But for the time, it was a very long-running Nicktoon.
I'm trying to think how to explain the premise as it started out. The blurb in the Radio Times used to say something like, the adventures of a streetwise kid. It's about some 9-year-olds who live in a city, and Arnold was supposed to be the main character, and he had a rather unusual family life. He lived in a boarding house with his grandparents and various eccentric boarders. And he and his friends would do things like play baseball and help local eccentrics and jolly around and go to the cheese festival and things like that.
If you have a mind to, you can find details of, if not videos of, the original claymation shorts by creator Craig Bartlett, which give you some idea, a good idea, of what his original vision was. An unsustainable vision, perhaps, or perhaps just a vision that got superseded by something more interesting.
We'll never know if it could have, coulda, woulda, shoulda, carried on as it started out. But let's talk about Arnold's character and how he started out. He was a sort of altruistic, incredibly nice, kind boy, and a thing that really kind of gets lost over the years, which we'll talk about some more, how it changes, is the dream fantasy sequences that he has. He's sort of supposed to have his head in the clouds and maybe kind of, I don't know, not fit in with the world.
Yes, I think that's certainly part of the original thought behind Arnold. Season 1, in many ways, is anomalous, and indeed during the course of the season, the character designs and the focus of the show changes drastically. But if you didn't know Season 1 and you came in and saw Arnold's dream sequences, looking up through his skylight and seeing a turtle flying past, you'd think, well, what is going on there? That doesn't normally happen. And you'd be right, it's something that's lost very quickly.
When I was younger, and I was never that young, was I, watching Hey Arnold? I was 11 when it started, and I'd seen Season 1 and a couple of the next seasons. I used to think I didn't like Season 1 quite so much, which was finding its feet and very different from how it ended up. But watching them again as an adult, I think Season 1, with that dreamy Arnold and focus being more on his bizarre life than what it will become, has its own very special charm and a sort of purity about it when they weren't trying to continue what they'd found to be successful.
That's right. It's a great shame once you look back and remember the early episodes how Arnold's original purpose and character do get completely lost. Not only with the change of focus after the first season, but also with the change of Arnold's voice. I watched through what recordings we'd made of it, which is all episodes in a funny order, about 6 or 7 years ago.
They're abridged, many of them, aren't they? Most of them, in fact.
Yes, ITV chopped them up quite a lot. And I really realised for the first time, once Arnold is no longer touring Cordell, he loses all his Arnoldness, all his quirkiness.
All of it?
Well, very nearly all of it. All his uniqueness. that half-lidded gaze that he adopts to show his Arnoldness no longer really features in the show and fits in with the new feel of the show. So that's a couple of circumstances conspiring there to take Arnold himself, the show with it, in a very different direction.
I remember being furious at the time when Arnold's voice changed, but you do get used to it.
You do get used to it, and there's nothing wrong with Arnold's other voices, which all sound very like each other, but nothing like Tor and Cordell. They're just rather generic, and you can read interviews. Craig Bartlett said, well, we wanted to recast Arnold and keep him sounding young and naive or whatever, and you think, oh yes, that's fair enough. And then you look back at season 1 and you think, oh, but it completely spoils the character, you fool, Craig. You should have just had Torin carry on and pitch it up a bit. It's very easy to do. You can do it in Audacity. Anyone can do it. In those days, of course, they were really able to do it easily enough in their TV studio, if not at home.
Well, I think if we both speak now about how we discovered Hey Arnold, that's going to lead quite nicely into how and why the focus changed. Perhaps if you talk about what I think you told me was the first episode you watched, and explain why you thought you didn't like it quite so much, that would be a good start to what I'm trying to accomplish.
Well, you may remember me saying about Blazing Dragons quite recently, how I had seen it advertised on CITV and thought, cartoon, I don't watch cartoons anymore. I'm 13 years old, god damn it. I was in the age of non-believing, as I sometimes say, which is one scarce bit of Bedknobs and Broomsticks that I liked when I watched it last Christmas. But I digress. Hey Arnold started on CITV after the summer holidays, after Blazing Dragons had been on, so the new September in 1996. And I remember seeing it being advertised and thinking, cartoon, stupid cartoon, I don't watch cartoons anymore. And some months later, after we'd moved house and many things had happened, Rosie had recorded 6 episodes of it on video, because evidently she'd been watching it and enjoying it, and I watched the video, and the first episode I watched was called Magic Show, which did draw me in quite strongly to the big plot and situation change in the show that we will come on to very soon. But I'd already seen a couple of snippets of a couple of episodes on CITV and thought, well, I don't like the look of this anyway. One of those episodes was an episode called The List, which is one of those season 1 episodes that Rosie was describing earlier about city childhood life, but I don't think it's one of the very best ones. I'd seen snippets of Haunted Train, which I think had the potential for me to enjoy, and I did enjoy it when I saw it properly later, and a couple of others, notably one where Arnold is asked if he has a girlfriend, and an image is cut to which rather misleads you in certain ways about the setup of the series, but I'm sure we'll come on to that.
That's the one where Oscar's staying with him in his room, isn't it? The boarder whose wife has kicked him out of their room.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's called, but that is the one. And I tell you, actually, one bit of the list I enjoyed was, Grandpa, did you eat all the cereal? Heck no, there's a whole other box, and it's a whole other box of old man brown flake things that Arnold doesn't want to eat. So I guess I did see some potential even in that.
Grandpa, voiced by Dan Castellaneta, of course.
Greg Bartlett, brother-in-law to Matt Groening, Dan Castellaneta's main employer over the past 30 years almost, in The Simpsons. But I guess I didn't really engage with it until I saw Magic Show and got very strong characterization, getting drawn in and getting involved with Helga as a character, and there's the name mentioned for the first time, having danced around it.
I wonder what episode came before Magic Show. Can you remember at all?
Oh no.
Never mind, but anyway, it must have been the one that made me decide I'm going to record this from now on. I don't remember what that was, but I do remember the first episode I watched, which is a much better one to catch than The List, and it's called Operation Ruthless, which is a very clever title, or quite clever, I suppose, and it's going to sound a bit strange when I describe the plot. Helga, this character, is actually secretly very much in love with Arnold, much more than a 9-year-old probably ought to be. And all the kids are at the cheese festival. At this cheese festival, Arnold is going after this girl he likes, who's a bit older than him. She's in the 6th grade or something, and her name is Ruth. And Helga is trying to, with the help of her best friend Phoebe, Arnold's best friend Gerald is helping him, Helga and Phoebe are trying to sabotage Arnold's attempts to get together with Ruth. So you see why it's called Operation Ruthless. Very good. It's got some very amusing bits. One bit I remember thinking, oh, this is a funny cartoon, is where Arnold's trying to plan how he's going to say hello to Ruth, and he's trying to sort of make it too elaborate, and Gerald says, just say hi, Ruth. So Arnold's going, yeah, I'll say hi, Ruth. Hi, Ruth. And then it cuts to a little bit later, and he's going, hi, Ruth, hi, Ruth, hi, Ruth. And then that's what he's actually planning to say to her.
You go up to her and then you say, hi, Ruth, hi, Ruth, hi, Ruth. Very funny.
That's not really going to work, is it? And what's Helga doing in the meantime?
She does things like try and get Ruth in the bumper car that doesn't work, and ends up in it herself, and tries to set herself up in the tunnel of love line with Arnold, which doesn't work.
And she comes across as pretty insane, obsessive bunny boiler, which in essence she is. And then I carried on watching Hey Arnold, having seen Operation Ruthless, and thought, oh yes, I'm going to watch this. And always I would engage most with the Helga episodes.
It's interesting how Operation Ruthless is, in many ways, like those exclusively first season episodes about doing crazy stuff in the urban environment. But actually, it sets a huge precedent for how the series is going to change, with the Helga and Arnold relationship becoming so prominent, and indeed, many of the more successful later episodes have the same formula as Operation Ruthless, where Helga will stalk Arnold and whatever companion he's with, Lila, Summer, and do stuff to them, being mean to them for no reason, as Arnold. And so you can see a big change there happening in Operation Ruthless without the show's makers realising it's going on. Of course, Operation Ruthless, as Rosie's always told me, she's quite right, it is an excellent one to start on because it tells you everything you need to know about the characters, about the situation. Of course, it actually really doesn't tell you anything about Ruth, and I always wanted to know more about her and hear her speak and stuff after watching that episode. And we weren't disappointed a little later on in the Valentine's episode, but we won't talk about that at the moment. When Rosie was talking about Arnold going, yeah, hi Ruth, and then going droning it on later, that was making me think how that's really full of Arnoldness, those lines, that delivery, that really only Torin Cordell can pull off. And Arnold loses a lot of his spark.
He was only a child at the time, wasn't he, Torin Cordell?
Yes, you look him up and you find he was born in 1982, so I guess he was at least 13 when he started recording for the series, but he'd, I think, been in the claymation shorts as Arnold, so he'd been doing it a little while, and he does noticeably deepen during the course of the first series, and the few second season episodes he's done. Well, voice is broken. But, you know, there are things you can do with that in the dub. I don't know why they didn't.
Helga is voiced by Francesca Marie Smith, who doesn't act anymore, and if you look her up on the Internet Movie Database, she only really has Hey Arnold and a couple of lines in Recess at the same sort of time as her credits. And you wouldn't really expect Craig to decide he needed to recast Helga because she's a girl, so her voice doesn't break. Although in a way it does, it changes, it sounds more mature. But that point aside, Helga's voice becomes absolutely crucial to the show. Obviously more than Arnold, because that kept changing. And when fans were asking Craig, is there ever going to be any more Hey Arnold? More on that later. The one person that he talks about, who would need to get on board, is Franny. And anybody else, Dan Castellaneta, Jamal W. Smith, who voices Gerald, all the other kids, they don't get a look in. It's just, well, if Franny would do it.
But they're all coming to do it anyway for the new one. Oh, we're not talking about that yet.
Not yet, no. So that tells you how important Helga becomes. A couple of the episodes that I watched in season 1 that I found interesting include Spelling Bee, which is all about Helga being in this spelling bee and Big Bob Pataki, her father, putting pressure on her to win, like her sister Olga. Helga's torn between trying to please her father and wanting Arnold to win the spelling bee because she's so in love with him.
I think Maurice LaMarche's performance as Big Bob is a big part of strengthening the importance of Helga's character and her relationship with her family, principally her father. So big credit to Maurice as well for bringing Hey Arnold to life and taking it in that new direction.
He's a very good voice actor, of course, excellent. And then a few weeks later, I was watching Hey Arnold thinking, oh, good, Hey Arnold, I'm so excited, new episode of Hey Arnold. It's a long time since I felt that way about anything. The title came up, Olga Comes Home. And I thought, ooh, we're going to get to see Helga's older sister who won all the trophies and she is constantly being compared to and doesn't really like very much. And so we did. And in that episode, Helga changes Olga's grade from college. She's a straight-A student, Helga changes Elizabethan poetry grade to a B+, and then Olga gets into bed and refuses to get out and is depressed, and Helga speaks to Arnold about it, and then Arnold comes to her in a dream, and he's like her conscience, and persuades her, or she persuades herself, using the lighter side of her character that Arnold has helped to shape, and confesses to Olga what she has done. And that's a very interesting episode for all the family relationships within the Pataki family and also Helga's relationship with Arnold.
It certainly is. It's interesting. When I was saying about Big Bob just then, my mind moved on to the thought that perhaps Helga's episodes about her and Miriam, who's her mother, voiced by Kath Soucie, aren't really as good as the Helga and Big Bob episodes. And I think, well, they're okay. I like the one where it's called Road Trip, where Helga and Miriam go on the road trip, and Miriam has to go on the mechanical bull. But there's a weaker one, isn't there, called B for Queen, which is supposed to be about Helga and Miriam. I think Big Bob is the better embodiment of what's wrong with Helga's family and what might potentially be right with it, possibly, one day.
There's more conflict there, isn't there? Because Miriam, being her mother, having carried her and given birth to her, does actually genuinely have a lot of love for Helga, which Big Bob doesn't quite so much.
And I suppose Helga is, in character, a lot more like Big Bob than Miriam, and they vie for the position of alpha male in some ways in the family. Or family organiser, perhaps. A better expression, as Helga is not male.
A reference to Halfway Across the Galaxy and Turn Left there. Because of the focus becoming primarily on Helga, usually her relationship with Arnold, but sometimes her relationship with her family, we do get to see Olga a lot more, and the relationship with her develops, and she becomes very much a caricature of herself, doesn't she?
Yes.
Olga, she becomes incredibly silly.
I always like to see signs that Helga and Olga might develop a better relationship as Helga grows up and gets to know Olga the person rather than Olga the ideal vision that her father's been foisting on her all those years. And we do see that at many times, although obviously the resentment towards Olga is still there at the moment.
Reasons why Helga does resent Olga are all to do with her parents, aren't they? They aren't really about Olga as a person, although she does find her very silly. So I suppose she doesn't like her as a person that much, but the reason she resents her is all the attention and praise that she gets from her parents. And Olga, for her part, is a nice person. I don't know if it's not completely genuine. It's to do with wanting to be liked. You could talk for hours about that, but she seems to love Helga and want to have a good relationship with her and want to help her and all that kind of thing.
I've always thought there's the potential there to get to know each other properly in the future. I think it's worth saying before we move on how there are many stories told, I suppose it's the same story really, about how Helga secretly loves Arnold was a throwaway idea from one of the crew.
It was Lisa Groening. I looked it up to check because I wanted to mention it in the I Also Like section of my Extreme Ghostbusters website, by the way. You can find some summary of what we're saying there.
When they were making Downtown as Fruits, which is the pilot, and you can perhaps tell from the title how quirky and weird the show's designed to be. Arnold and Gerald stuck downtown dressed as fruit. Helga's trying to organise this play, isn't she? And she's cross because Arnold isn't there. And then Lisa Groening / Bartlett has come up with this idea. Or what if Helga's secretly in love with him, and while she's cursing him in front of everyone, she's secretly pining for him? And it's very throwaway in Downtown Abbey, as I recall. She just takes out her Arnold locket a couple of times and moons over it. But goodness me, how that one idea developed and really carried the show, for better, for worse, or just for different, for another 5 years.
Well, speaking of Helga's locket, let's talk about her stuff. How obsessive and weird and slightly disturbing her love for Arnold is.
We were watching the movie on video and I went, she's got his pants!
Yes, she has an Arnold shrine. It starts off in her closet, as they call it in America, but I think it moves up into sort of attic space, doesn't it? A bigger space. And she's got things like his used chewing gum, and she's made a statue of him out of his used chewing gum. And she's got his pants, and she's got sort of pictures and stuff, which is slightly more normal, I suppose. And she's got loads and loads and loads of notebooks filled with poetry about him. And one quite early Helga episode that helped me to get interested in it was called The Little Pink Book. And in this episode, Helga includes a poem at the end of her current pink book, which is an acrostic with her name, and the book falls into Arnold's hands, and the episode is about her trying to retrieve the book before he discovers her name at the end. And that format for an episode was done again a few times. There's the one where she has to retrieve an answering machine tape, which young people wouldn't know what that means nowadays, would they? Where she's been on laughing gas at the dentist and phoned him up and left a message saying she loves him. There's one where she has to get back this parrot that's been hearing her recite a poem about loving Arnold with her name in, which, by the way, includes the line, "You make my girlhood tremble, dodgy or what?" And this parrot ends up in Arnold's hands reciting this poem that finishes up with, "My name's, or else my name's not Helga G. Pataki."
That's the one where Helga spies on Arnold while he takes off his underpants, by the way.
And I suppose those are the only other two which are exactly the same sort of thing. But speaking of spying on Arnold taking off all his clothes, both of those, I think, take the idea to more of an extreme than the Little Pink Book did. I can't remember now how much she's actually hiding in his bedroom and stuff. But in the one with the answering machine tape, what's it called? Helga
Blabs it all.
Helga blabs it all. She's lowering herself out of the attic on a rope and hiding around the house and all that kind of thing, and all Arnold's friends around, and she has to keep avoiding them, and she comes across as really quite insane, but not so that you don't like her.
It's extremely comical, that one. So is Helga's parrot. I remember thinking season 4, which Helga's parrot is in, was a bit weak overall, compared to 3 and 5, say, either side of it, and Helga's parrot was a bit of a high point in that series.
And other things happen in other episodes, like Helga gets a potion to stop her from loving Arnold, and Helga sleepwalks, is the name of the episode, to the boarding house, and ends up on Arnold's fire escape in her pyjamas, and Arnold and Helga are golf caddies for Big Bob and Grandpa, and most of the time it's something to do with Helga, and usually to do with Arnold as well.
A big deviation from the original premise, and it certainly works as a love story, a very different and unique take on a love story, but one that we all found very compelling. Possibly more sustainable than the original concept, who knows, but definitely a big change of direction.
We haven't talked about how much Arnold reciprocates Helga's feelings, have we? When I was watching the first series, it seemed to me that he wasn't really very interested and probably never would be. They didn't seem to me to be going in that direction with it. But then, after that, he starts to get to know her and understand her a bit better.
It's extremely interesting, that, and I'll just say as a slight going back to what we were saying just now, how Helga has sometimes been accused of being the right stalker and things like that by fans, and they're not wrong, of course, but as Rosie was saying, they have to do it so that you don't hate her or think she's too weird for doing it, and they do very cleverly balance Helga's stalker weirdness out by showing that she has a very difficult family situation, and that deep down she is very altruistic like Arnold. If you're still in any doubt of that at the end of the first season, you should be pleased to see in Arnold's Christmas, which I believe originally was the final episode of the first season in airing order, which makes sense if it ran from September to December, that Helga's feelings for Arnold lead to something good and heartwarming happening in the wider world outside the two of them and their relationship. The crux of it is Mr. Wynne, one of the boarders, who's a refugee, or was a refugee from Vietnam, is reunited with his long-lost daughter, Mai, all thanks to Helga's feelings for Arnold and Helga's determination to do something nice for Arnold, and that's a very heartwarming moment. Helga standing outside the boarding house in the snow going, "Merry Christmas, Arnold," and you're like, oh yes, she's not just a weird mad stalker after all.
By the way, Mr. Wynne is one of those characters you probably couldn't do nowadays because he's a bit too racist.
But coming back to what you were saying about the development of the Arnold and Helga relationship, when I was doing my watch of the videos 6 or 7 years ago, I was interested to see how their relationship did progress and change, much more than I'd really retained from watching it sporadically over 5 years or so. Yes, in season 1, Arnold, it seems, has no feelings of that kind towards Helga, but of course he doesn't really think of her in that way because he has no concept, certainly at the beginning, of her deeper character, her hidden depths, which he goes to such lengths to hide from him in particular. But then, as the series progresses, and it's a shame Arnold loses his original voice and Arnoldness, as this does change this relationship, but he comes to realise more about Helga's struggles, internal home struggles, and more that she's putting on a front and isn't really horrible and does have a good side, a lighter side to her. And then I think even more than that, once we get into seasons 4 and 5, Arnold does start to realise that there's a spark between them, that he has some sort of feelings for her. And perhaps Arnold and Lila shippers like to refute that. But then, if you watch the episode called Arnold Visits Arnie, in which he does not in fact visit his cousin Arnie, but have a dream about how he imagines it would be to visit his cousin Arnie, doesn't actually get round to doing it, we see that Arnold's ideal dream girl that he's after is the nice version of Helga, which is rather good for Arnold and Helga enthusiasts. A big sign, I think, that there's been some sort of change in their relationship and Arnold's attitude towards Helga is in an episode which I believe is in season 4 called Helga vs. Big Patty. Big Patty is a character who was created by Matt Groening, I believe, and she has a Simpsons overbite. She was introduced to the show as a kind of family favour or little quirky thing. Oh yes, Matt Groening designed this character. There are some issues I have with that episode about Helga willingly kowtowing to Big Patty in front of everyone when in the past she's shown herself willing and keen to appear physically and mentally a match for characters who are that little bit older than her, notably Harold, who is 13, probably, usually. But those issues aside, it's interesting because Big Patty talks to Arnold about Helga and to Helga about Arnold independently. And the impression she comes away with, and what she says to Helga at the end is, do you two have a thing for each other? Not, do you have a thing for him? But she sensed the same thing off both of them while talking about the other, which is particularly interesting, I think.
Yes, I thought that was interesting too. I think, by the way, Arnold and Lila shippers are few and far between, aren't they?
They're just trolls, really.
It strikes me that 9 times out of 10, if you come across a Hey Arnold fan, there'll be an Arnold and Helga shipper.
I always quite like the irony of Helga accidentally making Arnold fall in love with Lila, with her misjudged chalk drawing that she does on the wall that Rhonda and Lila and Nadine see. But I always thought they took it a bit too far as well, that Lila is an impediment to Arnold and Helga. That's why I liked Arnold Visits Arnie as well, which is a season 5 episode. Arnold seemingly goes off Lila and realises she's not the girl for him. Thank goodness for that. I do like Lila as a character. She's funny.
She is. The writers do seem to like Arnold to have his eye on something else, I suppose. It gives them material for episodes. I'm remembering the one where they do Romeo and Juliet at school.
Oh yes, it's called School Play.
I think a version of it has most of Mr. Simmons, the teacher's opening explanation missing because the tape didn't get going quickly enough or something, and it ends up with play, which is everything you need to know.
It's everything you need, yes.
Arnold's playing Romeo, and there are there 4 girls in line for Juliet?
Yeah.
And so Helga becomes 4th understudy, and she has to get through all 4 of them, and she makes up reasons why they won't like doing the play. For example, this tertiary character called Sheena, she talks out of it by telling her how violent it is.
That's funny because it's Francesca Marie Smith as well, just doing normal voice, and then Sheena voice, which is just that.
And Rhonda, who is the self-appointed Queen of Cool, unlike Courtney Grippling, and as told by Ginger, no one actually seems to want to be in her cool gang. But anyway, she is got rid of by Helga showing her an ugly costume she'd have to wear. You get the idea.
I like Helga manipulating Phoebe shamelessly there. Her best friend and Stu. She just absolutely rips into Phoebe. You'll forget your lines and your glasses will fall off, and Phoebe just falls to pieces.
Oh, yes. By the way, Helga and Phoebe have a genuinely very close, good friendship, which also goes through some development. But getting to play Juliet alongside Arnold does take precedence.
There aren't enough Helga and Phoebe episodes. The one with Ronnie Matthews, what's it called? I can't remember it at the time.
Preteen Scream.
Preteen Scream is the best one. And we were kind of hoping an episode called Best Friends was going to be about Helga and Phoebe, but it turned out to be about Rhonda and Nadine.
And we didn't even know they were best friends, and I'm not sure we even knew Nadine's name.
No, she was the background character.
And Phoebe breaks a leg is another good one.
Oh, that's a good
Phoebe
one.
and Helga.
Helga and Phoebe.
But anyway, that's 1, 2, 3 gone, isn't it? And then she ends up with Lila, and she can't talk Lila out of playing Juliet. So then Lila says, well, if you won't give me a reason, like if you secretly loved Arnold and wanted to kiss him, I think that was a good reason. So Helga threatens all kinds of things if Lila lets slip, and confesses to Lila that that is the reason why she wants to play Juliet, which is a very significant moment, and it's very good for Lila's character. Not only is she an amusing character, she is genuinely likeable, I think, even if she can be a bit annoying and silly, not unlike Olga.
I always thought they chickened out a bit after that. It was good to see Lila cunningly getting Helga to admit there, and then Lila's in on the secret. And that's just before they start doing all the Arnold and Lila stuff. You're thinking all the way through, so Lila knows about Helga's feelings all through this, does she? It's not where they should really be taking that development, or where they seem to be going with Lila. It's a bit arbitrary, Arnold.
Maybe they could have done something more interesting with it. I mean, she doesn't reciprocate Arnold's feelings, does she? But she could have maybe tried to push him towards Helga, knowing how she feels when he was after her, something like that.
Yeah, I always thought there was more potential than they got anywhere near realising with Lila being in on the secret, particularly as they did then go on to use her as the new Ruth, as it were.
Which actually, speaking of Ruth, brings us back to Arnold's Valentine, which I did want to talk about. What do you think about Arnold's Valentine?
It's a very important episode, Arnold's Valentine, a very good episode, and actually it's another one where you see that Arnold and Helga will quite willingly get on and like each other, fall in love, perhaps, under different circumstances in their everyday lives. You have to suspend your disbelief a lot, where Arnold doesn't recognise Helga with her hair done like a poodle, and believes it to be his French pen pal Cecile. But once you've suspended your disbelief, it's extremely amusing, their classic old Arnold runs hither and thither on 2 dates at the one time. And, of course, we do finally get to learn about Ruth as a person. Arnold learns that Ruth, voiced in that episode by Lacey Schubert, who did so much work on the Wild Thornberrys and various other things, is rather shallow and superficial and silly, and he doesn't really like her at all. Shiny chestnut hair, long slender legs, and a dazzling smile on their own, Arnold discovers, are not enough to keep his interest. Whereas while he has spoken with Helga in her Cecile disguise, got to know her properly or in a different way, he's found that he prefers some substance in his women. And what's particularly important about that episode is that it is Torin Cordell as Arnold, and obviously Franny as Helga, doing some kind of romantic interplay, and you see how that could have worked very well if Torin had stuck around. So that's really the only time you get to see the real Arnold having feelings about the real Helga, as it were. And so for that reason, Arnold's Valentine's extremely important episode.
Yes, I was thinking those very things when you were talking about how it's a shame the voice changes when they develop the relationship. And, of course, Helga's in disguise, so she's lost her inhibitions, she can be herself, and you see that she is still kind of a bit mad.
I love it. We've never met, never even seen each other before. She's hiding behind the menu and stuff. That's pretty brilliant.
He's saying, I feel like I know you already, and she does that, and he says, I mean, from your letters.
Oh, my letters. We used to laugh from Paris. It's quite a city, big, busy, full of French people. I thought you lived on a farm in the Loire Valley. Oh, oui, my farm. It's an absolutely terrible job Helga does trying to be Cecile, but Arnold doesn't seem to mind.
It says in the novelisation, although it's not a novel, it's a very short book, of the episode that she's got Olga's shoes on, which isn't specified in the episode, but she's got these 2 large high-heeled shoes on, and she comes in trying to look sophisticated and just falls over, and he has to catch her and stuff. She orders something off the menu without knowing what it is, and then finds out it's cow brains and eggs, and has to go and throw up. And she's still got that aspect to her character where she's kind of manic and crazy, but she's also being nice, which is the thing that's really missing for Arnold. So you see how Arnold is beginning to fall in love with the real Helga.
Yeah, great stuff, that. You might think, after watching it, their relationship's going to develop quite quickly and pleasingly. Perhaps it should have done, but of course they always wanted to spin out the show without changing the status quo. And they got a lot of good material out of the Arnold and Helga relationship, as it was anyway. Well, it's interesting when you mentioned the novelisation of Arnold's Valentine, because I was remembering how in that it's changed to, on the show, Gerald comes and nicks the real Cecile so that Arnold and Helga can have a chat about their feelings at the end, and Gerald does it off his own bat, probably because he realises Arnold wants to get rid of the real Cecile, talk to the fake one, and maybe Gerald has stirrings for Cecile, which he certainly seems to be implying. Forgotten all about Phoebe there. But in the novelisation, Arnold overtly goes to Gerald and says, look, can you get rid of my real pen pal? I've decided I don't like her. I like this mystery girl instead. And Gerald says, all right, then I'll do that. So I think Craig in his novelisation there wanted to show us even more strongly, even more overtly, that Arnold's ardour for mystery Cecile had been well and truly roused. Perhaps a little overkill there, a bit more subtle in the show, but certainly makes it clear what Craig's intentions were.
Well, that is interesting, and I like that conversation they have at the end. Who are you? And all that kind of thing.
I can't believe he still didn't know at the end. She's not even got her poodle hairstyle anymore. She's got her hair long.
Yes, that happens after she's gone to be sick and to sweat into her hair and stuff. But anyway, speaking of Gerald forgetting about Phoebe, we haven't talked about them, have we?
You get that from Operation Ruthless.
You do. Now, how many words do they actually say to each other on the screen in the 5 series?
Well, not very many. I should think about 60% of them are in Wheezin' Ed, where they're exploring the cave together.
That's right, and the interaction is actually slightly disappointing.
Mm.
But in the background, you see them exchanging glances, holding hands, quite openly exploring their feelings for each other. And a particularly interesting one, which is quite interesting about Lila as well, is Helga's Masquerade, where everyone goes to this fancy dress party, dress up, lose your inhibitions, that kind of thing, as Lila. And she acts like Lila, and in this way engages Arnold's attention and spends the whole party with him, and Arnold's getting interested in Helga acting like Lila. And in the background, you can see Gerald and Phoebe speaking about it and worrying about it. Then what actually happens is that Gerald comes along and explains to Arnold that he's spending time with Helga for the wrong reasons.
That was one of the two other episodes I thought we really should mention before talking about the end of the show, the end of the Arnold and Helga saga, for now at least. When I first read the blurb of that on the internet, before we actually saw it on CITV, and it said, when things go too far and Arnold accidentally calls Helga Lila, I thought, geez, how far are things actually going to go?
It is easy to forget that they're supposed to be 9.
Very easy. But actually, it's during a game of pin the tail on the donkey, as it very much were. But it's very well done, that episode, Helga's Masquerade. Also titled in places Helga as Lila, which is more overt and less interesting as a title.
It has fewer connotations.
Yes.
Because Helga's Masquerade could be the image she usually projects as picking on him for no reason.
Yes, they very much went with the correct title there, I think, when they were choosing the title to put on the final episode. But it's very interesting that, because it does kind of point the way to the future, and you get the feeling, or I do certainly, that Gerald and Phoebe aren't really surprised, I think, particularly Phoebe, that they're going to be having a chat about Arnold and Helga at some point. And you do get Helga, after she's taken off her costume, and come back to talk to Arnold as herself,
with her own clothes on.
Yes.
Not with no clothes on.
No, she did actually have her own clothes on underneath, fortunately. She actually talks there to Arnold honestly for one of the very few times in the series.
I think that's a good bit, isn't it? He says, "Why have you changed?" And she says, "I was feeling uncomfortable."
I took it off on her. It was really uncomfortable. I always liked it when she called him Arnold rather than Football Head, and was being more open and herself, and letting herself stray away from this character she created.
If you don't know it, it might not be obvious from what we've been saying that Arnold has a head shaped like a football. Sort of like Stewie Griffin, only a bit more extreme.
It's interesting, it's not one of those cartoons where they'll do things like get out a pair of scissors and cut out a piece of the backdrop and stuff like Tiny Toon Adventures. They don't acknowledge that they're cartoon characters, but they do remark on cartoony things, like Arnold has a football-shaped head, but then you can imagine that IRL, it's not actually as football-shaped as it's been drawn, and it's just a caricature characteristic that Helga has picked up on that would translate to the real world.
If you see his mother, Stella, who we'll talk about quite soon, I expect, she's got a slightly football-shaped head, but it's more believable as the kind of head you might see in the real world. So perhaps IRL, Arnold would have that kind of a shape for a head.
Yeah, and Helga would still pick up on it as a football head. When I was doing fanfic about Arnold and Helga, I picked up on Football Head as translating into kind of a pet name that she would call him, but I don't know if I really like that idea anymore. What do you think?
I think, given what we've just been talking about with Helga's Masquerade and how she does call him Arnold in moments of honesty, better that she doesn't adopt it as an affectionate term.
Yeah, I think so too, having talked about it and thought about it. Other episodes where there's pleasing, honest interaction between Arnold and Helga. Arnold's Thanksgiving. They have a lot of talking about their feelings there. That's a big part of their journey. The episode called Arnold and Lila, where Helga falls out of the tree where she's been spying on Arnold and Lila. And Arnold's like, "What are you doing up the tree?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm just climbing trees." And then they have a bit of a talk about affairs of the heart, which is quite nice. Some of them have the potential for some good Arnold and Helga interaction. And the one with the egg story is a bit disappointing there. It does have some good bits. Harold and Rhonda in that one is very amusing. I'm sorry I ate our first baby, Harold will say to Rhonda. It's not really a baby, it's an egg. And they pick up on the throwaway line from way back in season 1. You know you like me, Harold, but Rhonda says. And she will no longer admit to having said.
She develops into the kind of character who wouldn't admit to liking someone like Harold.
I like those cartoons on DeviantArt where somebody's translated those into Rhonda at high school, secretly pulling Harold into the janitor's closet, ravishing him, and then denying all knowledge of it later. But that's a slight digression. Harold and Rhonda has done better in Egg Story than Arnold and Helga. Yes, that's right. Another episode that's quite disappointing for Arnold and Helga in some ways is Summer Love. Now, it's a very good episode in many ways. I like the parody of the beach holiday and the seductive beach bunny Summer. Arnold and Helga winning the sandcastle competition together is very good, and Arnold does have a bit of a realisation there. I thought you were just being mean to me in summer for no reason, but now I realise you were trying to be my friend and stuff to Helga, so they do talk about their feelings a bit, and it's awfully funny when Helga comes to tell Arnold about the summer, and she makes it sound like the most unconvincing excuse ever. She's actually evil, and she's got this whole crazy plot against you, and you're like, yeah, I'm not surprised Arnold doesn't really believe that, although it's true. But it's not all it could be with the Arnold and Helga interaction. I always thought they should talk more at the end after it has all come out, rather than just win the sandcastle competition. Although they do a bit, and Helga starts to let her guard down a bit, and she quickly goes, well, what are we standing around yakking for? We've got a sandcastle competition to win, and grabs his hand and drags him off, which is quite well done. So I suppose it's not disappointing for Arnold and Helga, but they could have made more of it there and made it more of a clear stepping stone in their relationship, which I really thought they should. Actually, I was originally hoping that Arnold and Helga would spend the day together at the beach, having run into each other there, and enjoy it before Summer actually turned up in the story, and then she'd be the disequilibrium, as it were. But they didn't go for that, and she kind of turned up immediately. Arnold arrived at the beach before Helga had a chance to go to him and try to be nice to him, so I suppose it's not surprising they did it that way, particularly in a 25-minute cartoon. But yes, the potential there for more, but certainly a decent Arnold and Helga episode to watch.
Should we talk about Helga on the couch?
Yes, we certainly should.
That's an episode in which a child psychologist comes to the school, PS 118, to make sure everything's all right, see if anyone happens to need therapy, and she decides that Helga is completely mad and a bit too violent and wants to give her therapy session. So Helga has to go and have this therapy session and talk to, I can't remember her name,
Dr. Bliss.
Dr. Bliss, about her feelings, which she tries to avoid to start off with. It's a bit like the episode of Miranda with the therapist, where she makes the therapist talk about herself, and in this way, by mentioning her sister, I suppose Dr. Bliss is going along and waiting for a door to open up, and then she mentions her sister, which gets Helga talking about Olga, and then you get the flashback, don't you, to Helga going to preschool.
And she's voiced by Katie Bartlett, Craig Bartlett's daughter, and Lisa Groening Bartlett's daughter too, presumably.
Matt Groening's niece. And that's very interesting because it reflects a flashback that we've already seen from the present time, where Olga's there and Helga's going to school and her family are taking no notice of her, and then you go back to when she's 3 years old and exactly the same thing's happening.
Poor old Harold, he's been held back 3 years, even when he was that young. He's in preschool with the rest of them.
Yes. So anyway, Helga takes herself to preschool. I'm going to preschool now. And meets Arnold. She meets him by getting splashed by a car and having no parents to look after her, and him coming along with his umbrella and being nice to her.
Oh yeah, I like their first meeting. I like your bow because it's pink like your pants, is what Arnold says to her. He's got the patter even then.
So then what happens? She's drawn a little picture of Arnold and cut it out into a heart shape, giving it some yellow card backing so it looks like her locket that she'll acquire in the future. And she's saying, Arnold, I love you and I want to marry you. And who is it who discovers her and laughs at her?
Well, I think it's Harold, Stinky, and Sid all together, kind of noticing what she's doing and laughing.
So then, in like an instant, she puts up all her walls and becomes aggressive and nicknames her fists Old Betsy and the Five Avengers and goes around threatening to punch people. So it's not even something that develops slowly. It's quite interesting that Stinky, Sid and Harold have seen her doing that. Obviously, they haven't retained it. They don't have any inkling of it now.
It's probably the best episode ever in many ways. It is all about Helga. And I remember it was originally someone had written on the internet before it aired in the UK that it was a clip show. And he was like, oh, clip show. So we were very pleasantly surprised to find that it wasn't. It was actually an extremely original and well-crafted episode.
How tiresome of somebody.
Hmm.
Perhaps this somebody had seen it and assumed the flashbacks were clips.
Yeah, what a stupid thing to do.
Assuming too much.
Well, yeah, I know that's particularly as the two flashbacks kind of complement each other with certain bits. Helga's, I'm going to preschool now, and you've already seen her go, I'm going to school now, and you think, okay, and then she's done that all the time since she was 3, wandered off to preschool on her own. It's carefully crafted, not like a clip show.
Of course, if it was real life, you could have Big Bob and Miriam up for child abuse, couldn't you?
Yes, indeed you could. Miriam would be sent to Alcoholics Anonymous, and consequences would occur.
The reason you say that is because Miriam is constantly falling asleep around the house and in strange places, and a lot of fans think she's supposed to be an alcoholic. And perhaps they're right. Maybe she's not very happy either.
The other episode I think we should mention before we come on to the end of the Arnold and Helga saga, the end for now, is Married, which is a late season 5 episode, as is Helga's Masquerade. And I think Helga's Masquerade would be a much better one to leave your Arnold and Helga thoughts on in season 5 than Married. It's a little disappointing, Marriage, I think. It features Arnold and Helga's visions about what it might be like if they got married later in life, like Rhonda's marriage predictor paper cutout fortune teller thing says they're going to. And it is interesting when you clearly see that in Arnold's dream he confronts Helga and says, look, I know you're not really like this. Being married to you wouldn't be like this. What the hell are you doing? And Helga starts to do her confession to him. You think, oh, he knows. But that's the only thing really going for the episode. I don't really like Helga's fantasy sequence that much, where she's President of the United States and a spy and stuff and goes to rescue Arnold. It's not all it could be, Mary.
What is quite funny is that Arnold, who, as a running gag, no one knows what his surname is, and his name's Arnold Pataki.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you something which I think is quite interesting, which I don't know if you know. I read one of the many interviews with Craig Bartlett that you could find a long time ago. He was asked, what do you think about fan fiction? What do you think about fan art? And he said, I think it's very interesting. Sometimes I take inspiration from it when I'm trying to think what would the fans like out of an episode, such as the characters grown up. So, I think perhaps Married was inspired by fan art / fan fiction, but perhaps Craig didn't really get the sort of thing people wanted from seeing the characters grown up. Something that's occurred to me as well watching Married is that in Arnold's dream there are some babies and the stork brings them. And thinking about Arnold's age and his innocence, you kind of think, oh, well, I suppose it's not surprising if Arnold doesn't know where babies come from. We were saying it's easy sometimes to forget that they're 9, because it's quite sexual in many ways, their relationship. But I sometimes think Helga doesn't have a stork in her dream. She doesn't have babies by any other means either, but you get the feeling she's a bit more worldly wise than Arnold, so I wonder if maybe she does know where babies come from.
Yeah, I think she does. I think she's kind of worked it out from all her lusting she has for Arnold. Now, the end, as we've called it, is Hey Arnold the movie. which was theatrically released in December 2002 in this country. I don't know if anyone went to see it. Well, I think it might have reached number 3 in the chart on teletext, actually, so I guess some people did go to see it. But it has a long and complicated story behind it. This podcast is already long and complicated. But basically, Arnold Saves the Neighborhood was written as a 3-part episode to finish the 5th season. And it was then decided, no, it's not going to be a 3-part episode to finish the 5th season, it's going to be the theatrically released movie, which was originally supposed to be something else. This did leave the way clear for 3 later episodes, which were April Fool's Day, which is quite funny but a bit disappointing about Arnold and Helga, and the 2 parts of The Journal, which is supposed to set up Jungle Movie, which we'll come on to in a bit. But the problem with Arnold Saves the Neighborhood as Hey Arnold the movie is that it does come across like a 3-part episode, which it was written and made as, rather than an epic movie to finish things off. Characters who should be included quite a lot don't get included at all. Characters like Phoebe, who have one line, really should have a lot more to do in a theatrically released movie, and it just doesn't do the show justice in all the ways, or most of the ways it should, which is the problem, I think, with Hey Arnold the movie, basically.
It would have been fine as a 3-part season finale, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The reason it was allowed to have a movie was because it was so successful and popular. And then, if you ask Craig Bartlett about why he changed his plans, he will blame it entirely on the network and his bosses. He will say, they made me make that a theatrical movie so that I could set up for the real movie with the 3-part episodes, and then because Hey Arnold the movie didn't do ever so well, they said you can't have a second movie, so I wasn't allowed to finish. I don't know how far that's true. I suppose no one knows except the people involved. I get a bit of a feeling Craig wanted to do certainly the Journal episodes to set up for the Jungle movie, and if he'd really wanted to make the Jungle movie straight off, they would have let him.
The big thing in Hey Arnold the movie, Arnold Saves the Neighborhood, was supposed to be, and still is in many ways, Helga's confession, which is a fairly well done scene, although it could be better, and Arnold gets into the situation where he badgers her until she comes out with it, because he knows she's going to come out with it, and then after she has come out with it, Arnold finds himself completely unprepared for it when it comes to the crunch, which I think is a situation we can all relate to. And when I first read that that was going to happen in the movie, and there was the trailer for Hey Arnold the movie, and one of the bits is Helga going, I love you, Arnold, I always loved you, ever since I first laid eyes on your stupid football head. There's progression of football head as a term for him, isn't it? Perhaps that's where I got it from. But anyway, as it was originally intended, I believe, and Craig said this, that was going to be the start of, well, getting them together, as it were. But then, annoyingly, when it was changed into the theatrical movie, the ending was tweaked. Again, this is what I have read. It's conjecture, I suppose, in many ways, but I do believe it's true. The scene where Arnold, at the end, gives Helga her out to say, oh no, I didn't mean it, was added in later, so that the real follow-through from the confession scene would be saved up for the Jungle movie, which fits in with what we've been saying, doesn't it, about how Craig abandons Arnold Saves the Neighborhood as the finale and concentrates his effort on putting everything into the Jungle movie as the finale, which he doesn't then get to do. Which is a poor decision, as it turns out. But wasn't that annoying, that change to the end? It's real trolling your audience.
Yes, everybody hates that, except the young lady who interviewed Craig in the bit that I was paraphrasing, where he was explaining what happened. She liked it, but I think she's very much in a minority.
You remember that comment we read on the movie database?
Oh yes.
Arnold and Helga should have became friends. hands. And we were like, yes, you're so right. Grammatically bad poster. They should have. One thing that I found interesting when reading the novelisation of Hey Arnold the movie was some of the screenshots, which they have in a photographic pictures section in the middle, you know, the sort of things in these books. And you can see that on the bus, the crashed bus, after everything's alright, the videotape's been shown and everything.
What tape, says Grandpa, because he doesn't know about that plot development. That's a funny bit.
That's brilliant, Short Man. What tape? Short Man is Arnold's surname, the fans reckon.
No.
Craig says you can hear it throughout the series, and Grandpa always calls him Short Man, so he's Arnold Shortman.
Okay.
It makes sense as a theory. I don't know. I'd like to leave it as a mystery myself. But in the screenshot of this anyway, in the book, you can see Arnold and Helga holding hands on the bus. And you think, well, that's indicative of a different development in their relationship and end to the movie at that point. So proof there that what they say about the changing of the ending and the trolling of the audience in terms of Arnold and Helga is in fact correct.
It was a long time before we got to see those 3 episodes that replaced the movie as a 3-part finale, and I think we sort of stumbled across them on Nickelodeon channel by accident, didn't we?
Yes, we did. They didn't show them on CITV.
And Jake had to rush in from somewhere where he keeps a store of videotapes, put the videotape in the machine, press record, and it was indeed April Fool's Day. And what's quite interesting about that is that Arnold uses his knowledge of Helga's true feelings, even if he's pretending to believe that she didn't really mean it, in order to manipulate her in exchange for her having manipulated him by pretending that she has been permanently blinded by his April Fool's joke. I think you found that quite interesting at the time, didn't you?
Yes, I did, and I found it more interesting when I read the script on the internet than when I watched the actual episode. I thought Arnold could have said a lot of his lines in a very canny and knowing way, which I'm sure Torrin Cordell would have done, which would have shown how he knew all about Helga and was using her feelings in a particular way to try and get back at her in some ways for pretending she'd been blind. And there was things like Helga pretending, which I thought he could have said in a very knowing, telling way, like, yeah, she does that. And the little conversation they have where they're dancing and Arnold's trying to trick her, as it were, into fessing up. He could say the things he says to her in a way that says, come on, I know the truth, you know I know the truth, let's just stop faffing about and show a little honesty. But he doesn't really say it like that. But then, of course, it's the chap who's voicing Arnold in that, Alex D. Lentz, has never voiced him before, so he probably doesn't get the deeper significance of what Arnold's saying. So yeah, again, more potential there for Arnold and Helga than is actually realised.
So then the next 2 episodes are The Journal, and what that is Grandpa reading Arnold his father's journal from when he and Arnold's mother were in the jungle in Central America, working as doctors, meeting each other, getting married, having a baby. Is it in Arnold's parents, the episode where we actually learn who they were and what they did, that we find out that they flew off to Central America and never came back?
Yeah, that's a season 3 episode, Parents' Day, and it's a very, very good one, and it completely sets up for the journal by giving us the bare bones of what we need to know and have been wondering for so many years about Arnold's parents. And then the journal absolutely fleshes it out in preparation for the Jungle movie.
We find out that Miles and Stella, Arnold's parents, have had this baby, Arnold, and then this absolute arse called Eduardo comes and makes them fly off to do doctoring in Central America.
They never came back, as Grandpa said.
I mean, someone else could do it, couldn't they? Someone who didn't have a 1-year-old.
They shouldn't have done it. They should absolutely not have done it. There's absolutely no excuse. Sod the green-eyed bastard. They're not your 1-year-old son, are they?
And the creators want us to say, oh, what a sad story. Oh, they were doing something altruistic, and of course they were doing the right thing. Well, I'm sorry, I don't think they were. Someone else could have done it. Someone who didn't have a baby. The journal is telling the story, as I say, how they met and fell in love. Grandpa actually closes the book and refuses to carry on reading at the bit when they're about to have sex, which again suggests that Arnold doesn't know about that kind of thing. Although we do get the birthing scene, to some extent. Arnold's saying, oh, that's interesting, I enjoyed hearing about what my father and mother get up to, and then it finishes with him finding in the journal a map of where they've gone, and clearly beginning to hatch a plan of going to find them. And that is what the Jungle movie was going to be about, or indeed is going to be about.
It's interesting, if you ever are watching early Hey Arnold and you don't find Arnold's grandparents particularly good characters, strong characters, likeable characters, which I think is extremely unlikely, particularly in the case of Grandpa, but if you hadn't engaged with them so much, I really think you'd start to engage with them a lot. I don't see how you can help it after watching Parents' Day, where you see how they take Arnold in and help him to adjust to life after his parents sod off and leave him. I'm scared because I can't find my mommy and my daddy, he goes.
In his dream.
And Grandpa comes in and bees there for him and cheers him up without actually saying, oh, well, don't worry, they'll be back soon, and they actually won't. So I'd pick Parents' Day as the episode to get to know Grandma and Grandpa, particularly Grandma, who really isn't in it that much.
The main thing about Grandma is that she's completely senile and she thinks Helga's Eleanor Roosevelt and things like that.
Yes, I think she knows actually completely what's going on with Arnold and Helga and kind of keeps it to herself behind her slight mask, although it's slightly real, of senility. And it's interesting, in the episode Girl Trouble, you found out that Grandma and Grandpa started off with the same relationship as Arnold and Helga. Franny voices young Grandma Gertie in that episode.
You're not supposed to know it's her, but you can work it out.
Yes, pretty obvious. And you also learn in that one that Grandpa has worked out exactly what's going on because it happened to him.
Sounds to me like maybe she kind of likes you, Arnold.
All this hanging around you she does. I've even seen her skipping rope outside the boarding house waiting for you to come out. And Arnold's like, yeah, whatever's, Grandpa, but it's rude. I think this will bring us nicely on just to say a couple of words about some of the other supporting characters before we talk about Jungle Movie, don't you? Because you can see from this podcast, which we've been recording for almost an hour and a half now, but probably I'm going to edit down to somewhat less than that. You can look at the timer now and see how much has been chopped out and go, ooh, that's interesting. You can see from that how we've been sitting and really talking about Arnold and Helga for an hour and a half, or most of it. And so it becomes very obvious that is the enduring main point of the show, even though it wasn't supposed to be at first. There's a ton of supporting characters around the city, around the boarding house, but they were never quite as interesting or made such good episodes as Arnold and Helga, so that's why we haven't really talked about them.
Some of them we have mentioned.
So let's just say a few words about some of them. We'll talk about the boarding house. Season 1 has quite a lot of boarding house episodes. One where Gerald comes over to spend the night with Arnold, sleep over with Arnold, for the first time. I know, they're supposed to have been friends for years, but Arnold introduces Gerald to the boarding house concept like it's a whole new thing. I didn't always think that completely made sense.
I think Gerald was complaining that Arnold never invited him to his house, and Gerald had been often inviting Arnold to Gerald's house, perhaps trying to imply that Arnold had been keeping his boarding house a secret the whole time they were friends, but still doesn't really ring true, does it?
Yeah, that's right. They did do that, so it did kind of make sense. But yes, makes sense but not ring true. That's an important line. But yeah, there's a lot of boarding house episodes in season 1. I always liked Oscar, who was mentioned earlier, who's a bum and sponges off his wife, Susie, and pawns Arnold's stereo and stuff. Bets in a card game, actually, doesn't he? Mr. Kakashka, that's mine. And there's Ernie, the builder, who likes well, he's more of a demolition worker, really, isn't he?
Yeah.
And Mr. Wynne we mentioned, of course. And then in season 1 they have this border brown-haired woman called Lana Vale, who never really says anything or does anything and disappears after the first season.
And there's the man with the chicken.
Oh, Mr. Purdy with his chicken.
Do you have a chicken in here? No. It sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it?
And then, of course, there's Mr. Smith, door number 16, secret agent sort of character, and he completely disappears after season 1 because there's not really much you could do with it, really. It's just rather funny and quirky, a lot of season 1 is. But what I'm trying to get round to saying, and not really managing, is that there's no boarding house episode in season 2 at all. And doesn't that show the new direction the show is taking without the creators really realising it? Well, yes, it does. And then obviously for season 3 they make something of a conscious effort to come back and include the boarding house characters some more. They do have more boarding house episodes after that.
And they have more sports episodes and the other kinds of episodes they were going for, don't they?
Yeah. So they perhaps try to come back to the roots of the show a bit, but really it's mainly about Helga and Arnold. And it's no bad thing. But it is a thing nonetheless. I mentioned how Grandma isn't in the show that much. It seems Tress MacNeille may not have been able to commit to the show as much as Craig or other members of the production team may have wanted, and that's why her other character, Miss Slovak, who's the fourth grade teacher for Arnold's class, gets replaced by this character called Mr. Simmons.
Who I did mention talking about play.
Voiced by Dan Butler. He adds a lot to the show, quite funny, and you get a lot of him and his problems that he masks with his sunny exterior in the Arnold's Thanksgiving episode, which is another reason why that's a good episode, as well as the Arnold and Helga stuff. And you've got these supporting adults like Mr. Green the Butcher and Mrs. Vitello the Flower Woman, who's in about 3 episodes and then the movie at the end. And the postman, who was voiced by the jazz man, Lou Rawls, who died in the past few years. And all these funny, vivid characters who just kind of bring Arnold's world to life, particularly in the first season. It's another symptom of the show changing in ways they hadn't expected, how they all kind of go into the background and you don't really see them and have them involved in episodes very much because it doesn't really fit in with how the show's developed.
You see Dino Spumoni more than you might think, don't you?
You do see Dino Spumoni more than you might think, and indeed more than you might want.
I just remembered him. He's sort of a Frank Sinatra singing person.
Yes, that's right. His daughter is Nancy Spumoni, the fashion designer, or snow boot designer anyway.
You think there's just going to be this one episode with Dino Spumoni and then he's everywhere?
But obviously the main secondary characters, most of whom we have already mentioned, are Arnold's classmates, and as well as doing their bit to fill the Arnold and Helga episode, or complement the Arnold and Helga episodes with their own little subplots, they do mostly have episodes of their own. We haven't mentioned Eugene, who's the class jinx, and they do manage to get some funny episodes out of him and his unlucky mishaps. Always worth tuning in for those. We didn't mention Curly either, who is even more of an excessive stalker than Helga when it comes to Rhonda, at least in season 5 is, anyway. And Rhonda has some interesting episodes about being the self-appointed princess, and she's very rich and loses all her money and can't cope, and gets glasses and can't cope, and that sort of thing. And we used to quite enjoy episodes about Sid, I think. It's quite funny.
Sid's a bit sort of mad, isn't he? There's this one where he wants to impress Lorenzo, who's a new rich kid, by pretending that Arnold's bedroom, which has all these gadgets and stuff in it, is his bedroom, and he goes up to Arnold and he says, "Can I borrow your room?"
And there was Arnold Saves Sid, where Sid wants to be Arnold's personal slave after Arnold saves him from the chicken giant chicken sign falling on him.
There's this one where Sid carves Principal Warts, the school principal, out of soap, and then Principal Warts isn't there, and Sid thinks he's killed him. And is that the one where Arnold's walking along trying to get to class, and then Sid drags him into this cupboard? So that tells you why Sid can be quite amusing.
Sid is very comical, very wacky, very out there, and using him in that way in episodes here and there works very well. And that brings us quite nicely on to Stinky, who's this kind of country bumpkin character, and hangs out with Sid a lot. And there's this one episode where Sid sings Stinky is a vampire, and then it turns out at the end, oh, Stinky actually is a vampire. And you often get in Hey Arnold little bits at the end where, oh, the haunted train was real, oh, the ghost bride was real, just to make you think at the end. And then taking it to Stinky really is a vampire is a step further, but I think they do it very tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, that's another type of episode, like a Helga episode, a boarding house episode, a sports episode, an urban legend episode where they investigate the haunted train, the ghost bride, and then they find out they're barking up the wrong tree, but then just at the end they say, oh, but it really was real, they just didn't find it.
Gerald is the keeper of all the urban legends, has to tell us the stories. Yes, that's the kind of episode they thought there'd be more of in the show than Helga goes around with a wrench, stopping Arnold and Lila having a good time. But it didn't turn out that way. We mentioned Harold quite a lot. Harold has some good episodes. Harold's bar mitzvah I always liked.
Of course, he has to be 13 to have the bar mitzvah.
He's got some hidden depths, Harold.
There's the one where he goes to fat camp and they do a bit of a knowing laugh at themselves for children aged 8 to 14.
Yes, he's definitely aged 8 to 14.
Because a lot of the time he does seem to be their age.
Particularly when he's at preschool with them, as I was saying earlier.
Yes, or when it's a huge deal that there is another 13-year-old in the class, Torvald, and he's been held back so much.
That's right. And there's the mud bowl, isn't there, where they're trying to play the 5th graders at football, and you're like, well, Harold really shouldn't have a problem playing the 5th graders at football. He's 2 years older than them, and he's supposed to be quite an early developer anyway. Physically, I mean, not mentally.
Yes, I mean, if it weren't for the bar mitzvah, I don't think anyone would have ever suggested he was 13, would they? But they wanted to do the bar mitzvah episode.
When he admits to Big Patty, and Harold and Big Patty episode, that he is 13 and has been held back a few years.
That's right, it does get revisited.
I think, yes, that's how it should be, so we have to take things like Mudball with a pinch of salt. So I guess what I'm really saying there is that the secondary, and indeed tertiary, perhaps not originally meant to be tertiary but turn out that way, characters are strong and do good episodes and do their bit for the show, and there's no episode that you would watch and not take anything away from and say, oh, that was just complete crap, although obviously there are weaker episodes, stronger episodes, and a lot somewhere in between. But I do think it's certainly true that the Arnold and Helga relationship is the heart of the show, far more than it was ever intended to be, perhaps even after the first season had been written. And I suppose it just goes to show real success isn't planned, it's just how things work out and you have to go with it.
So then why do we keep implying that the Jungle movie is going to get made? Well, because it is. Why is that?
Well, we often say, and we're quite right, how everything nowadays is a rehash of something from the past or an attempt to relaunch something from the past. The BBC at the moment, when we're recording this, is having their sitcom season, trying to relaunch old sitcoms. They're not admitting they're trying to relaunch them, they're presenting it as a bit of nostalgia, but they're also trying to do it.
And if you want more examples, there's new Jurassic Park movies, new Terminator movies, new Planet of the Apes movies, Bates Motel, Sleepy Hollow, stuff like that is what they've got on television at the moment.
BFG, The Jungle Book, they're just redoing old stuff, not nearly as well as it used to be done, of course.
Of course, because they've all run out of ideas.
And Nickelodeon is obviously feeling the pinch as well. Its Nicktoons well has run dry. Of course, the other thing like SpongeBob SquarePants that's massively overtaken Hey Arnold, and indeed Rugrats as running for hundreds and hundreds of years now as Fairly Odd Parents. But surely SpongeBob SquarePants and Fairly Odd Parents watching them nowadays must be something like watching The Simpsons and thinking, oh, that reminds me of a much better episode from 20 years ago. Why do they still bother making it?
I've seen episodes of the Fairly Odd Parents, thought that within living memory.
So, obviously, Nickelodeon has realised, well, we're just pouring out crap now. I know, let's go back and revisit some of our really successful stuff. Perhaps they realise they've absolutely done Rugrats to death, and All Grown Up is a part of that. And so they've gone back to their second most successful popular Nicktoon ever, remembered that it wasn't finished, and said, oh, well, let's finish that then.
Of course, Craig already had his script already, didn't he?
Yes, fans were clamouring for it to be released as a novelisation at one point, but obviously Craig wanted to hold on to it until he got the chance to make it properly when Nickelodeon came crawling back to it, which he obviously knew they would.
What I find very interesting is that if you can find fan activity from years and years ago when it was finishing, thousands and thousands of absolutely devastated fans going, please, Craig Bartlett, can't you give us a novelisation or something of the Jungle movie? And he was saying, no, don't think so. But now that it's actually happening, where are they all? They've lost interest.
So that's going to be on Nick sometime in 2017, apparently, with much of the old voice cast returning, obviously Francesca Marie Smith being the vital one, but people like Maurice LaMarche, Dan Castellaneta, Tress MacNeille are in it. They've apparently got Toran Cordell in a different role. They've got Jamal W. Smith back, not as Gerald, and they kept him on as Gerald. Even when his voice broke and they had to manipulate it digitally so much and it still sounded too deep, why didn't they do the same thing with Arnold's voice? Much more important to Arnold's character, I would say. But he's not going to be doing Gerald anymore, apparently he's doing another character. Most of the boys are different, basically, and the girls and the adults are the same. But is it going to be any good? Well, I read a very worrying thing once where Craig was saying the idea would be that Arnold would stay in the jungle or in Central America with his parents and not come back to the city, Hillwood, as it is revealed to be called, we haven't mentioned yet, and it's in the Pacific Northwest where Craig and the Groening family grew up. Washington State, it's fairly universally supposed to be, and I think, well, that's bullcrap. Arnold's parents probably want to leave the jungle now. I've been trapped there for 10 years and I don't really see why Arnold's going to stay there and live with them, but, well, Rosie knows the reason, she's going to tell us.
Another reason why that's bullcrap is that he's discovering his feelings for Helga, and he would want to go home and explore those, wouldn't he?
Yeah, it's an arbitrary impediment to the Arnold and Helga relationship development.
Yep.
It's part of this upcoming reason.
Part of this upcoming reason, which is Craig was hoping, because Helga was such a popular character and she had been proclaimed the most complex animated character ever or something like that by someone or other, he was hoping that he would be able to make a spin-off show called The Patakis, which was going to be set a few years later. I think Helga was going to be 13, was she?
I think it was 15, you know.
So he wanted her really quite mature.
Getting boobs, he wrote in one interview about it. I thought she'd probably have quite big ones by the time she's 15.
Well, yes, I suppose it depends how quickly you develop.
And she's quite tall and thin, so they might not be that big, actually.
Anyway, at first I thought that sounded like quite a good idea. Focusing on the Pataki family, it would perhaps be like episodes which did that, Spelling Bee and Quantity Time, which is all about Helga and Big Bob spending time together.
Brilliant episode, though.
All the ones where Olga comes back. You think, oh, okay, more of that kind of thing, but Helga's more mature. You think, maybe she's with Arnold. Maybe the Patakis have gone somewhere else, so they're in a different setting and Arnold's not there and Helga's annoyed and wants to be with Arnold. But in fact, the reason Arnold's not there and Helga's annoyed wanting to be with Arnold is that he's stayed in the jungle with his parents, and the supporting cast of the Patakis was going to be pretty much exactly the same, apart from Arnold, so it was going to be Hey Arnold without Arnold.
Yes, not exactly what you want from a spin-off, really, and I've always had serious doubts that the Patakis would have been any good, and Rosie's been saying, and I'm sure she's right, perhaps Nick has thoughts of commissioning the Patakis off the back of the Jungle movie if it's successful, and, well, that may well be in their minds.
Yes, not plans as such, but as you say, thoughts, because as we said, they are running out of ideas. One thing I've seen it described as is sort of like All Grown Up, but for Hey Arnold. But that's not really going to work, is it? Because they're already all grown up in Hey Arnold. They're already very close to the age that the Rugrats end up in All Grown Up. And I think my idea about having the Patakis in a new setting, Helga's been dragged away against her will, some sort of thing for Big Bob's beeper business, is a much better idea, but no, Craig wanted to have Arnold move away for arbitrary reasons, or stay away, and make Hey Arnold without Arnold.
Which is very strange, so hopefully they might come back and rethink that and plan it properly if they do get up to a new series. But we'll have to see how the Jungle movie, which is a TV movie now, of course, goes.
I mean, it seems a bit sort of pointless to have one-offs if you're not thinking maybe you could get something off them.
Just like the BBC with its sitcom season. I read a lot about the Patakis, people's thoughts about the Patakis, interviews with Craig about the Patakis on the internet in about 2001. And one thing he said was that perhaps the episodes would be narrated by Helga writing a letter to Arnold, you know, the sort of thing.
I remember reading that.
Dear Arnold, this is what happened recently. And I thought, well, that would be quite a nice way to do it, wouldn't it? And perhaps Arnold would occasionally visit her, see him at the end of the series, saying, gee, thanks for your letters. But then it says at the end of the interview, oh, and of course she wouldn't ever send them. She'd write all these letters to Arnold, but they'd just pile up and she wouldn't send them. And you think, well, what is the point of that then?
I don't remember reading that. I mean, they're supposed to have come to terms with their feelings, aren't they?
Exactly. They're supposed to be in a couple and be going to get back together at some point, obviously. And why would Helga hold back at that stage on sending him the letters? She wouldn't. She'd want him to see them. She'd want to see them. So I think that'd be a terrible shame if they went that route with it.
She'd send her knickers with them, wouldn't she?
Yes. It takes Helga backwards in her development. It takes her back to the shrine in the closet sort of thing. Secret letters that no one's ever going to read in her drawer sort of thing. So that'd be a great shame.
The thing is, if you're going to make a spin-off, there's no point in clinging to the status quo that you've been desperate to maintain in the original because you're afraid of what'll happen if it changes. Quite rightly, in As Told by Ginger, which I did briefly mention. Two of the characters get together and then I didn't like the show anymore after that. Kim Possible, the same thing happened. But if you're making a spin-off, a new show, that's the time to move things on, isn't it?
So I hope you're listening to all this, Craig, and that we see the Patakis as it should be. Letters to Arnold, decent way to get into it, but for God's sake, he receives them, reads them, and smiles. So there we are. Hey Arnold's past and Hey Arnold's possibly future. Watch this space and see what happens. We've said that in a few podcasts, haven't we? Since then, things have happened, like the Ghostbusters movie has come out. We've not seen it, but made certain comments about what we know about it. So
New Chipmunks movie.
New Chipmunks movie. So maybe sometime for a special New Year treat, perhaps we can have an up-to-date podcast just to see what's changed over the past year. I think that's the end for now of our thoughts about Hey Arnold. So join us again next time for another, much shorter, I should think, podcast on The Iron Giant, a movie from 1999, which we watched quite recently, and we'll need to podcast about before we've, well, not exactly forget it, but switch off all our engagement with it until we watch it again. So join us for that, please. Until then,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.